Have you ever bought an incredibly expensive, top-tier annual gym membership on January 1st, absolutely convinced you're gonna go 5 days a week, only to stop going entirely by the second week of February? Well, yeah, me too. Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're doing a complete mental audit of the fascinating and frankly sometimes deeply flawed architecture behind how our brains process risk and uncertainty. We're going to dig straight into the academic source material on judgment and choice, basically breaking down the exact cognitive gears turning in your head every single time you place a bet, make an investment, or honestly just decide whether or not to grab an umbrella on your way out the door.
So why exactly do we make such terrible choices under pressure? It's a fundamental question, right? And to answer it, we have to understand the psychological traps and the completely invisible frameworks we rely on when we're facing the chaotic reality of everyday decision-making. You know, we really love to think of ourselves as these perfectly rational creatures, acting like pristine, logical human calculators perfectly weighing the pros and cons. But the reality? It's way messier. We are literally running on ancient cognitive hardware. Our brains are wired with these highly specific, deeply ingrained mental shortcuts that were absolutely fantastic for surviving in the wild centuries ago, but they often lead us entirely astray when the modern stakes are high.
Okay, let's take a quick look at our roadmap for today. We're breaking this down into 4 parts. 1. The architecture of choice. 2. Misunderstanding probability and logic. 3. How our brains warp information. And 4. Calculating value and risk. Starting with Section 1, the architecture of choice, where we'll look at understanding the foundations of uncertainty. Because look, we really can't understand our bad habits until we understand the foundational tools we're supposedly using. The source module emphasizes that learning to look closely at the concept of probabilities is the essential first step in understanding our own cognitive architecture. Probability is the core mathematical concept used to evaluate the likelihood of events. It's the literal language of risk. But to actually grasp this, we have to look at how remarkably poorly we apply it in real life. Take weather forecasting, for example. If a weather app tells you there's a 30% chance of rain, a massive majority of people intuitively think that means it's going to rain for 30% of the day, or maybe it'll rain over 30% of their city's area. But mathematically, it actually means that out of 100 days with these exact historical weather conditions, it rained on 30 of them. To make a logical choice under risk, you're mathematically required to weigh the likelihood of different outcomes. But here's the kicker. While probability is the objective math of the universe, our human brains are notoriously terrible at calculating that math intuitively.
Moving right along to Section 2, misunderstanding probability and logic. This is exactly where our mental math completely fails us.
First up on our tour of mental glitches is the gambler's fallacy. This is a classic trap where we completely misunderstand how independent probabilities actually work. Imagine you're standing at a roulette table and the ball has landed on black 5 times in a row. Your brain is practically screaming, red is practically guaranteed next. I mean, it's totally due. But guess what? The wheel has no memory. The probability of red is exactly the same as it was on the very first spin. So why do we do this? Because our cognitive architecture intuitively expects a short sequence of events to perfectly mimic long-term statistical averages. We basically think the universe owes us a correction. The source highlights this as a prime example of our hardware failing. We mistakenly link entirely independent past events to future outcomes, totally inflating our perception of risk.
Now let's look at the conjunction and disjunction fallacies. This shows an even deeper inability to calculate overlapping or separate risks. The conjunction fallacy happens when we foolishly assume that highly specific conditions are somehow more probable than a single general one. There's this famous academic example called the Linda problem. Imagine a woman named Linda. She's 31, single, outspoken, and deeply concerned with social justice. Now what's more likely? 1. Linda is a bank teller. Or 2. Linda is a bank teller who is also an active feminist. Most people jump at option 2, but mathematically that makes 0 sense. The probability of 2 entirely separate events happening together is always less than or equal to the probability of just one occurring alone. But our brains love a good cohesive story, so we get totally tricked. Conversely, the disjunction fallacy is when we massively underestimate the likelihood of at least one of several events happening. Think of a complex machine, like a car engine, right? Hundreds of interconnected parts. If each part only has a 1% chance of failing, our brains naturally think the car is virtually perfectly safe. What we fail to realize is that adding up all those independent 1% risks means a major breakdown is almost mathematically guaranteed over enough time. We're terrible at adding up independent risks, which leaves us completely blindsided by actual statistical realities. Which brings us to Section 3, how our brains warp information. Let's look through the lens of bias to see how we distort raw data long before we even try to make a choice.
Consider the massive gap between what we feel and what is statistically real. Let's talk about the availability heuristic. This is our natural tendency to judge the likelihood of an event based entirely on how easily an example comes to mind. If you just binged a terrifying, sensationalized documentary on shark attacks, you might flat out refuse to swim in the ocean. You feel the risk is incredibly high just because that terrifying image is so easily available in your memory. Now compare that to base rate neglect, where we completely ignore the actual underlying statistical reality, the base rate. The base rate tells us a shark attack is statistically microscopic compared to, say, the very real, everyday danger of driving your car on the highway to get to the beach in the first place. But a car crash isn't as dramatic or memorable as a shark attack. We warp the world to fit whatever dramatic memory is most available to us, and we literally toss the math right out the window.
And compounding all these warped perceptions is confirmation bias. The source material points out that our brains actively filter information to selectively support what we already suspect is true. Let's say you're convinced a certain tech stock is going to absolutely soar. Your brain will latch onto every single positive news article about that company and conveniently ignore or creatively explain away the negative financial reports. It's like a built-in internal echo chamber hardwired right into our cognitive architecture, turning us into extremely confident yet entirely incorrect fortune tellers. It actively prevents us from accurately assessing risk because, well, we're essentially burying our heads in the sand of our own opinions.
Finally, let's hit Section 4, calculating value and risk. How do we actually assess worth once our brains have thoroughly warped the probabilities?
The source module contrasts two absolutely crucial concepts here: expected values versus expected utility. Expected value is the cold, strict math of a decision. If I offer you a strict 50% chance to win $100, the expected mathematical value of that bet is exactly $50, unchangeable math. But expected utility, that accounts for the subjective, deeply human element of worth. To a billionaire, that $100 payout has incredibly low utility. It means absolutely nothing to their daily life. But to a broke college student trying to scrape by and buy groceries for the week, the utility of that exact same $100 is massive. The strict math is identical, but the human worth is completely different. This difference between value and utility is absolutely vital, because it's our expected utility that directly shapes our individual attitudes towards risk. Whether you are deeply risk-averse, completely risk-neutral, or a total thrill-seeking risk lover depends entirely on how much utility, how much personal, subjective satisfaction, pain, or relief you get from the outcome. Understanding your own personal utility curve is literally the secret to understanding why you take the risks you do in your career, your relationships, or your personal finances. I mean, it explains why two perfectly rational people can look at the exact same data, the exact same probabilities, and make completely opposite choices. They aren't doing the math wrong, they're just solving for completely different personal utility.
To wrap up the mechanics, our decisions are finalized through three last architectural quirks detailed in the text. First up, framing effects. We react entirely differently depending on how information is packaged. If a doctor says a complex surgery has a 90% survival rate, we usually opt in. But if they say it has a 10% mortality rate, we panic and back out. It's the exact same math, but a different frame creates a totally different choice. Second is bundling. Would you buy a highly overpriced, slightly sketchy piece of insurance completely on its own? Probably not. But bundled into the price of a brand new flat-screen TV as an extended warranty, you don't even blink. How options are packaged together completely changes our perception of their risk and reward. And third, mental discounting. This is the exact quirk that famously sabotages our retirement savings. Our brains naturally devalue future payoffs. We'd way rather take $50 today than wait a full year for $100. We steeply discount the future because uncertainty makes us incredibly impatient, which causes us to make choices that hurt our long-term interests just to secure a quick short-term win.
So, knowing all of this, knowing about the absolute trap of the gambler's fallacy, the total blindness of base rate neglect, the incredible power of framing, and the highly personal nature of subjective utility, next time you take a risk, ask yourself, who is really making the choice? Is it the rational, logical you? Or is it the invisible, highly biased cognitive architecture running quietly in the background? Understanding these concepts is the crucial first step to taking back the wheel. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the way you choose.